that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and we've got a great show for you. We're going to start out with Mike Viola. He's with the Foundation for Economic Education, but we're going to be talking about the filmmaker David Lynch and what that says about American culture. Then we're going to turn to John Fund. He's been on the show often. John is with National Review. He's a columnist with National Review. And we're going to talk about assessing Trump so far. We're a little over 2 months into his presidency, and we want to see what John thinks is going on right now. And then in our last hour, we'll turn to Dan Pilla. We often turn to Dan Pilla around tax time because he is our tax expert. April 15th is just around the corner, and if you've got tax questions, you can ask him. But we also want to talk about some of the changes that are in this year's tax forms, some of the things that the Republicans are looking at doing, and then how that's all going to play out for us here in the near future. So you'll want to stay with us for the full 2 hours. We're going to turn now to Mike Viola. As I mentioned, he is the head of analytics for the Foundation of Economic Education, and he is also on the board of America's Future Atlanta, and that's advocating for local solutions to issues facing the metro area. He went to the University of Chicago, and he's joining us, I believe, from Atlanta. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Dr. Matthews. Thank you for having me on.
Well, you have an interesting article up. We have a link to that on our website, pointofview.net, where you're looking at David Lynch as a director, one of our more important, I would say, directors in the 20th century, and just did some great work out there. But why did you pick David Lynch over, say, Cecil B. DeMille, who gave us the Ten Commandments, or Stanley Kubrick, who gave us 2001: A Space Odyssey? Why David Lynch?
So David Lynch has always had a really important place to me. He, as you may know, he passed away in January,
yes,
which was really a wonderful time for, I think, people to revisit his work. But what's so interesting to me is he leaned in very heavily to very distinctive elements of American culture, right? Like, I love what you mentioned about Cecil B. DeMille, and I love Stanley Kubrick, but they didn't pull from Americana nearly as much as David Lynch did. Mm-hmm. And you look at a lot of his most famous works, a lot like Twin Peaks, where, you know, he really leans into the Pacific Northwest, woodsy, sort of inland Washington culture. Or you look at his road movies like Wild at Heart, where he really likes the kind of old school, almost Western protagonist. He does some really interesting stuff in his films that I think shows how much he appreciated a sort of aesthetic that only exists in America.
You know, what's interesting in part, I think, about David is you see two sides of America and individuals. You see, in many cases, an optimistic, upfront side, traditional, but then it's also often confronted with this dark, seamy side that exists, but many of us don't always see.
That's right. He really leaned into the idea that America is worth preserving, it's worth respecting, but it's not perfect, and it never will be. I really like that everybody you see in his shows, sort of like you described, there's always a seedy underbelly, even to idyllic towns like Twin Peaks. At the same time, he also understands that, you know, there are great things about American cities, but they're also full of really not so great poverty and grime mm-hmm. and crime, which I really think he's just very good at understanding the good and bad in everything. And that's part of what's so beautiful about his films.
You know, you start out with Steven Spielberg in your article mentioning the three of his, what I think are his best movies, Elephant Man, Blue Velvet, and Mulholland Drive. But you focus a little bit more on Twin Peaks, Eraserhead, and Wild at Heart. But to Spielberg's point, something like Elephant Man, when you're talking about that sort of two sides of things. You've got a man who is grotesque to look at. He has elephantitis. He's struggling to survive, but he has a warm inner side that you find out in the movie that sort of makes us think we shouldn't always judge people by the outward appearance.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. It's also worth noting that the Elephant Man was somewhat early in Lynch's career.
Yes.
Eraserhead came out, I think he was about 30. It came out in the late 70s. I think it was 77.
Yes.
And then, so he was probably in his mid-30s or so when he released The Elephant Man. And that's, by David Lynch standards, a pretty normal movie.
It is.
Right. And so I think what you just described, I never thought of it that way, but I think it's really interesting that he had that type of experience so early in his career, and working with such a talented actor as Anthony Hopkins to bring sides of that out. I have to wonder if maybe that was a big influence on later shows like Twin Peaks, or Twin Peaks being a show, or later films like Mulholland Drive, like Wild at Heart, Lost Highway, that leans so much into duality and ambiguity. So that's a really interesting perspective.
Now, you spend a fair amount of time talking about Twin Peaks, and I would almost put Twin Peaks in the reverse, which is you've got something that looks normal and objective on the outside and traditional, but then on the inside you've got some challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Twin Peaks, of course, there was the original two seasons of it in the 90s, a prequel movie called Fire Walk with Me, and then a third season that came out in 2017, which was actually Lynch's last major work. And what you describe is, there's this idyllic town, but a lot of, unorganized crime going on below everything. And you have the first episode starts with us finding out, I'm not spoiling anything that doesn't happen in the first 5 minutes, but a first episode that starts out with the local homecoming queen has been murdered. You find out all sorts of things that were in her past that nobody knew, and the exploration into that in a place that seems so perfect. I think that's really, it opened up such a really interesting form of storytelling in two ways. The things that are good about Twin Peaks are real. They were not imagined. They were not a fiction, and they weren't just a front for the seedy underbelly. But it also shows sort of, right, the nature of sin, right? People, There's so much going on underneath everyday life and what you're able to show others that even someone who seemed as perfect as Laura Palmer, who's kind of the golden goose of the original Twin Peaks, even her seemingly perfect life before her murder, you find out that she was a very complex person caught up in some bad stuff. And I think knowing that sort of experience for people is everywhere, that a lot of people are going through a lot more than you see when you talk to them on a normal day is a really telling insight of his work.
My guest for this, we'll have one more segment with him, Mike Viola. He is with the Foundation for Economic Education, and we're talking about his article that looks at the filmmaker David Lynch and some of the perspectives he brought in there, especially his storytelling. And Mike, when we come back from the break, I want to get into this issue of storytelling because that's something that Hollywood seems to have lost, and getting that storytelling, that's what draws people in. I mean, that's what makes things memorable to us when we see that story that we just haven't seen, and it speaks to us. So stay with us. We'll be right back with Mike Viola.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Doubt is a perennial concern for Christians. Every Christian has feelings of doubt at one time or another. Unfortunately, many Christians assume that doubt is the opposite of faith. They assume that wandering among the hard questions of faith will lead us further from a belief in God. Travis Dickinson, a professor of philosophy at Dallas Baptist University, has his latest book, Wandering Toward God, Finding Faith Amid Doubts and Big Questions. He was in my radio studio recently to talk about his book and provide hope and guidance for Christians who have questions about their faith. Doubt is a natural phenomenon. He quotes from C.S. Lewis, who said, "Now that I'm a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks very improbably. But when I was an atheist, I had moods in which Christianity looked terribly probable." Part of the problem with the way we see doubt is that we assume we must have certainty. But even prominent atheists reject the idea of certainty. Bertrand Russell observed, "The demand for certainty is one which is natural to man, but nevertheless an intellectual vice." Voltaire concluded, "Doubt is not a pleasant condition, but certainty is an absurd one." Travis Dickinson encourages us to ask big questions and look for answers. There are so many theologians and apologists who provide clear and cogent answers to the many questions Christians and non-Christians are asking today. In the concluding chapters, he gives reasons for God and reasons why we can trust the Bible. He also addresses a few of the common questions raised against the gospel and Christianity. Is the God of the Bible good and loving? And why is there so much pain and suffering? So if you know people struggling with doubt about their faith, this is a book that will take them on a journey back to a biblical foundation. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. My guest for one more segment, Mike Viola. He is with the Foundation for Economic Education. We call it FEE, based in Georgia. Used to be based in New York. And we're talking about his article on David Lynch and his film. And Michael, we were talking about just the storytelling there. And there are so many. I mean, sometimes Washington, almost in spite of itself, comes up and tells a good story, like Driving Miss Daisy or To Kill a Mockingbird or something. What's happened to storytelling in Hollywood?
I unfortunately think a lot of people have let agendas drive storytelling. That has kind of been seen, I think, in recent years with winners of the big awards. I think the fact that that doesn't create very good art has really been laid bare in recent years. And I think in particular with the kind of additional eyes back on David Lynch's worth since his passing a few months ago, I think people now have such great examples of what storytelling used to be. One which was, in Lynch's case, I think did have values infused in it, but was not throwing them in your face. It was understanding that the story, America is a wonderful backdrop for these stories that he would tell. And there are all sorts of values that are going to be a part of that. But the actual writing and visual part of it are critical. And you cannot put the ideology first.
So you mentioned sin in the first segment here, and some of the things we're seeing in the sin emerges. And so looking at this, how does looking at sin in the films help us come to, say, an understanding of sin, redemption, and that type of thing, forgiveness?
Forgiveness, that's an interesting question. I think something really telling in a lot of Lynch's greatest protagonists is they do fail. And sometimes you see redemption on screen for that, sometimes you don't. In one of my favorite movies, Wild at Heart,
right,
from the early 90s, it's protagonist, played by Nicolas Cage. The only time they ever worked together, but really, Nicolas Cage and David Lynch. That's a hard combo to beat. The Nicolas Cage character robs a feed store at the end to provide for his girlfriend, and this guy's more or less on the up and up the whole movie, and then makes a big slip, and that kind of leads to him going to jail, him being estranged from the girlfriend, him eventually abandoning her, and then realizing after an appearance by Glenda the Good Witch from The Wizard of Oz that he needs to go back to her and provide for her. And, he's already been forgiven for the robbery, so it's time to rebuild his life. I think that's a really beautiful, touching ending, almost in a way that is not as... It's more direct than I think most Lynch movies are in terms of that sort of message, but that also really leans into the characters you met the whole time, and you really can see them evolve.
We should mention that that several of Lynch's films are not really for children; they're not appropriate for children. But moving to Blue Velvet, you have Jeffrey Beaumont, played by Kyle MacLachlan, and he's a college student, traditional background, good, clean kid, but he's sort of drawn into this seamy side that you get the impression, I don't want to be drawn into this nastiness and seamy side of life, but something just kind of keeps drawing him. And we see people like that sometimes. They don't want to be drawn to this evil, but they can't seem to break away from it completely.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think that plays such a big part in a lot of those movies. One that really comes to mind from that point you made, it's true in Mulholland Drive as well, where again, yet another movie that's not a kid movie, and has a lot of challenging things to grapple with. But the Naomi Watts character, right, where we see 2/3 of the movie her living in kind of this sunny fantasy land in LA, becoming a young actress, and then in the last third of the movie, seeing that not only was that all a delusion, but she was actually an incredibly embittered person who makes worse and worse decisions because of her already, jealousy of others' success and her just caught up in that world of having no values other than wanting success for herself that never really seems to come. So in that case, there's not really much redemption, at least not that we see in the movie. But I do think it shows Lynch's great eye for understanding how people can kind of lose track of values and fall apart, and what that looks like. You see this magnified in Lynch, but there are a lot of broken people in the world. Oh, absolutely.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say I think he does really draw on that natural brokenness of sort of the human condition, and something for someone who creates such fantastical and otherworldly films, or incorporates so many of that elements in them. On the human element, I never find myself not believing the human turns of events in Lynch's movies, right? I when you see his main characters develop sort of in that sense, whether it's through darkness or redemption, I always buy it, right? Even as so many other crazy things are going on. And I think that's telling of kind of the understanding the role of sin and redemption in good storytelling.
Now, you also think that Lynch sort of reflects the Jeffersonian ideals or values of self-reliance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's the best of his protagonists anyway. I'm thinking mostly of Dale Cooper on Twin Peaks. Do have kind of an act now, apologize later attitude in their work, a real libertarian streak. But they nevertheless maintain respect for the normal people around them. They are somewhat live and let live, but they still have a moral compass driving them to their sort of ultimate point. And I think Dale Cooper in Twin Peaks is, in a way, a stand-in of Lynch's own morality, or maybe the closest we ever get to it, at least on screen. I really do think sort of I almost think Dale Cooper and Laura Palmer, the homecoming queen who was murdered in Twin Peaks, I think sort of reflect David Lynch's idealized male and female virtues despite all of their flaws. And so I think despite all the troubles that they face, still having a moral compass through sort of the difficulty of being, independent in a free country like America is, it's sort of that combination of both those Jeffersonian values and his moral vision that he somehow weaves into these complex characters.
Mike, we have a couple of minutes left, but let me ask you, how do you think David Lynch has affected other directors and the film industry?
That's a really interesting question. Well, unfortunately, I wish his influence were wider than people like to credit him for. I think people are so in awe of a lot of his films that they always talk about what an influence he was. But you look at the turn that Hollywood has taken in the last, say, 10 to 15 years, I think the obsession of messaging, and unfortunately, I actually think they didn't take the most important lesson from Lynch's work, which, is that staying true to the ideas and to the storytelling and to the visuals is really what makes the most beautiful movies. In that sense, I almost don't want to overstate. Having said that, I do think a lot of the more challenging works of maybe like the last 30 years did pull a lot from him. I'm thinking of The Sopranos, for example. Another show not for kids, of course, but that contains a lot of really interesting moral questions where, I think sort of portraying as complex of a character as Tony Soprano, who goes in between like what it means to be an American, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a provider, and his mob life's compromising of all of that is very Lynchian. And you've heard it straight from David Chase's mouth that David Lynch was a huge influence on that show.
And
go ahead.
I was just going to say it's the bad guy who we like.
Yeah, totally. And so Lynch certainly had a few of those, but it's also just the depth of the storytelling and seeing the moral questions and sort of the dream psychology play out for these characters on screen in such a convincing way is what made The Sopranos great, and I think what really shows the influence Lynch has had.
My guest for these two segments, Mike Viola. He's with the Foundation for Economic Education. Thank you so much for joining us, Mike.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and we're trying to get John Fund on the phone. He's out of the country right now, so we're trying to make that connection, and he's trying to get in as well. So while we're going to do that, I wanted to talk with him just a bit about his assessment of the Trump presidency so far, first 2 months. And he told me we need to focus on this new article that just came out. It's really interesting. It's in The Guardian. In a new book, top Biden aide describes how out of it President Biden was before the Trump debate. And it's interesting when you go through this. He says, in this new book, Joe Biden's former White House chief of staff, this is the former chief of staff, paints a devastating picture of then U.S. President, his mental and physical characteristics at the time because of the problems that he had. Ron Klain served Biden from 2021 to 2023, then returned to his side last June, or the June right before the debate. And he began working with him to prepare him for the debate. And he says in the book, Biden didn't know what Trump had been saying and couldn't grasp the back and forth, what the back and forth was. These are quotes from the book. He left preparation to go be by the pool, obsessed with foreign leaders. And then he says, quote again, these guys say I'm doing a great job as president, so I must be doing a good job as president. He didn't really understand what was the argument was on inflation and the other things. And that apparently when President Biden said, if I look a little confused or something, people are going to think it's because Trump didn't make a good argument during the debate. And Ron Klain said, no, Mr. President, if you look confused, people are going to think you look confused. Now, this goes back because this is former chief of staff writing this, and this goes back to something we had been talking about for some time, which was that Joe Biden was just simply not up to speed. He was declining mentally and to some extent physically, and wasn't able to sort of carry on as president. And yet his defenders around him constantly made the case that in fact he was good and able to continue as president and was just as good as he should have been. And so it's an amazing revelation. I think we may have John. John, are you on with us now?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Hey, good to talk to you. I know you're out of the country, so sometimes that can make connections hard, but I was just talking a little bit about this article you highlighted on Ron Klain. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it just goes to show that the media was literally either asleep or complicit in one of the greatest cover-ups of American political history. This should frighten every one of your listeners. We had a president whose own chief of staff, Ron Klain, who's on his side, says he was gaga and was in a fog, thought that he was leader of NATO, not the United States. I mean, we've always worried about globalist presidents, but this is ridiculous.
Well, John Fund was a longtime member of the Wall Street Journal. He's a columnist for National Review now. He's been on with us many times, and one of the country's top experts in elections and especially election fraud. So, John, what I wanted to do is I just wanted to get your assessment. We're in 2 months of the Trump presidency. He's supposed to be releasing his tariff assessment today. What do you think about him so far? What's your take on it?
I think Trump is one of the boldest and most innovative presidents, but he has some blind spots. And one of the blind spots is he's trying to pass an extension of the tax cut that he passed 10 years ago in 2017, at the same time that he's trying to completely reorient our tax system to one that's dominated by tariffs. I think that's biting off more than you can chew. I think that the uncertainty that he has created because he's changed his mind on tariffs, how many times since he started? I think the uncertainty has driven the stock market down dramatically. I mean, the 401k plans of your listeners are being affected by this. I think he has to decide, he has 4 years. Why can't he pass the tax cut bill first and then move on to tariffs in a more coherent way when he's already got, the important vehicle for economic recovery and growth in his hand, the passed tax bill that even gets better by exempting tips and exempting Social Security and exempting other things from taxation.
I heard Larry Kudlow, the economist and TV commentator, say essentially the same thing, that, excuse me, he wished Trump had gone with the tax bill first, got a real win for businesses and individuals, and then moved on to try to work through the tariffs. But that's not the approach he's taking, apparently. And the problem, John, it seems like, is we're not clear what tariffs are going to be in, when they're going to be in, how long they're going to be in. Are they going to be changed if a country bends in the next week or two? It's made it very, very unstable for businesses.
Well, you're exactly right. And let me make the best possible case for Trump's tariffs, which are that, yes, the United States often confronts countries that treat it unfairly in terms of trade. And you can pick up a cudgel called tariffs, and you can use that to bludgeon other countries to do the right thing and reduce their tariffs. I get all that, but the problem is the way the tariffs usually work out is that it takes a long time for countries to figure out how much they're going to be hurt by tariffs. And in the meantime, you're going to get a lineup of American companies and American special interests that are going to say, oh, can't we have an exemption? And Trump is already granting exemptions. The problem is the tariff policy should be uniform. It shouldn't be riddled with Swiss cheese exceptions to the rule, because that creates unfairness. It advantages some companies ahead of others. It disadvantages other companies. It picks winners and losers. And Republicans aren't supposed to believe in an economy where the government picks winners and losers. So I think theoretically you could make an argument for Trump's tariffs, but in practice, look what it's already done, and he hasn't even imposed them.
I think one of my concerns here is that he says this is going to it's going to force companies to come back, bring their manufacturing back to the U.S., and things are going to be great. But that doesn't happen overnight. Even if you come and tell the president we're going to build a new factory, once you get started, it may take a year or two to get that up. You hire people, and then its influence on the economy doesn't get started immediately, and you could easily be 2 or 3 years into the presidency before you start feeling the real effects of it, assuming it's a success. And he's got a midterm coming up next year and other things that might just really hamper him if he does not show success immediately.
If the tax bill does not pass, we've seen consumer confidence plummet. We've seen a slowdown in the economy. The blame can be apportioned. I'm sure Biden takes some of the blame, but Trump's erratic approach, tariffs on again, off again, one country gets them, one country doesn't get them, is hurting people's confidence. Business hates one thing even more than higher taxes, and that's uncertainty in government policy, because they can't plan and invest for the future. So, look, I wish Trump well, but we need to get the tax bill passed first before he goes and experiments, because that's basically what it is, with tariffs. Tariffs worked 150 years ago when we didn't have an income tax. Tariffs today, when we have an enormous income tax, enormous corporate taxes, enormous taxes of every kind, that's an unproven theory. And I think that before we get put on the laboratory table and experimented with, we need a tax cut that will ensure economic growth first.
We've got a little bit more than a minute before our break, but we had 2 elections yesterday in Florida and then a Supreme Court election in Wisconsin. Your take on that?
Well, it's pretty clear that the Democratic funk that they were in last November, at least in Wisconsin, has ended. Young voters, college voters, liberal voters turned out dramatically. Trump did drive up turnout a little bit over the last Supreme Court election in Wisconsin, but the Democrats drove it up even higher. Politics is about enthusiasm. And what you saw in those 2 races in Florida, yes, Republicans won them, but they were not enthusiastic because they're confused. And I think they're confused because their economic fortunes are uncertain. 50% of Americans have investments in the stock market. And the stock market, how's your stock market account been doing lately, Merrill? Not mine very well.
I'll be working for years.
So the point is, Democrats are finally catching on that Trump's confusion is creating uncertainty, that uncertainty they can ride to victories in special elections. Now, that's fine because we have a year and a half till the next special election, to the next regular midterm election. Mm-hmm. But what if the tax bill hasn't passed? The economy is going to be in the doldrums. We may be in recession. And the Republicans, if they lose the House of Representatives, I'm not worried about the Senate, that means Trump's program will be dead in the water if he loses the House in the next midterm election.
John, we're going to take a break. When we come back, let's talk about Elon Musk. Stay with us on Point of View.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with our special guest by phone, John Fund. He's the national affairs columnist for National Review, longtime writer, one of the country's experts on elections and elections fraud. And John, I wanted to touch base with you about Elon Musk, because Trump's been the big topic, but Elon is right up there, right behind him.
Well, Elon Musk has become the heat shield for Donald Trump because, as you know, Trump wants to shake up the government, but he doesn't necessarily want to take the heat for cutting government services. So Elon is there, and Elon, of course, being an extremely successful space executive and auto executive can say, this is what I was born to do. I was born to shake up dying companies and rejuvenate them and cut payrolls and make them efficient. So I think that they were a perfect match. But Trump today told his cabinet that Elon is probably going to be heading back to run his businesses, and certainly he's paid a price for that. I mean, Tesla stock is down 37%. Elon is worth a lot of money, but he's worth a little bit less now because of all of the heat put on him. And I think it's been outrageous that someone who wants to shake up government, wants to improve the workings of government, is having his cars firebombed, having his cars attacked on the highways. This is not America. This is hooliganism. This is sanctioning violence against property and trying to destroy someone's company because he is trying to change government. And the answer to that is argue with Elon, defend the government programs he's trying to reform or cut, justify them, but make a case for that, not a case that somebody should be run out of business because they disagree with you.
So what do you think about Elon with his interest in the government? I mean, this concerns me. It's one thing to have a billionaire in there changing things and rattling cages, but Elon's making changes to the FAA, but he has contracts before the FAA. He selected for NASA is apparently going to be the nominee for NASA, but he's got a lot of business through NASA, and it's a conflict of interest, I think, that should be troubling us, even if in the best of circumstances.
Yes, of course, it should be. And if Elon were going to be staying all 4 years, I think that it would be completely unacceptable. However, remember, he's only been running Doge for 77 days under Trump. There's no evidence that new government contracts that he hadn't gotten legitimately before through competitive bidding have been added to his portfolio. There's no evidence that someone has been hired solely because he's a friend of Elon's. So I think Congress should conduct oversight hearings after Elon wraps up Doge and goes back to run his businesses, as Trump indicated today that he soon will be. But in the meantime, I think the country and the republic will probably survive if Elon's there for 4 or 5 months, and there's no evidence that he directly profited or benefited from it. But I agree with you. If this were a long-term thing, it would be completely unacceptable.
What is your take on the judicial? You had Republicans thankful that judges stopped a number of things that Biden was doing. Now you have Republicans being very critical of judges who are stopping a number of things that Trump is wanting to do.
Well, there's ways to stop things and ways to not stop things. I think the crux of Trump's argument is this. There is nothing in the Constitution. There is nothing in statute law written by Congress. There is nothing in our American tradition that allows a federal district judge, and there are 175 of them, I think, to issue a court order from the bench and say this not only applies to the people who are suing in my courtroom, but to 330 million Americans across the entire country. There is no sanction for this. It crept in, basically during the New Deal as the courts started to aggrandize more power. And of course, it accelerated during the Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. But there's no basis for it. There is, if you're going to sue and you want it to apply to the whole country, you should file a class action suit. And the shortcut for these judges is, because these liberal groups know, and by the way, some Republicans did this too, but the progressives have done this to, taken it into fifth gear. They know they can find a judge if they go to a court that they know is liberal enough. It's called forum shopping, and they can stop a Trump measure across the country until an appeals court or the Supreme Court rules on it. It's a completely unacceptable tactic. So, of course, I believe the judges should be monitoring a president's executive orders, and some of them may be invalid. But the way to stop them is you take them to court. You don't freeze the entire process with one district judge who's never been elected to anything affecting the entire country.
You know, we had Elon Musk coming in and firing a lot of people. They've had to turn around and say we made mistakes in certain areas and bring people back. Does the public look at that and say this looks like it's done way too haphazard, slipshod, and not really thought out? And does that end up affecting Trump in some ways, you think?
Well, Trump has a reputation for, what's the best way of putting it? Shooting from the hip?
Yeah.
Bull in the china shop?
Shooting first, asking questions later?
Yeah. There are pluses to that and there are minuses, and we're seeing that. Trump wanted to get started early because he knew how much opposition would be riled up by his actions. So he wanted to move on all fronts all at the same time to sort of divide his enemy, confuse them, and put them off balance. I do think that as he goes now to finish his first 100 days, there is a need for more reflection, for more planning, for more responsible use of his authority, because if these mistakes accumulate, you're going to have problems. I mean, we already have the case of one person who's been sent to that horrible prison in El Salvador. He's apparently not supposed to be there.
Right.
And the government can't figure a way to extract him. I don't care if it's just one person. That is an outrage. And if you make mistakes like that, you can destroy families. So I think we have to be more careful. But I generally approve the direction and the thrust of what Trump is doing.
So to your point, does some of Trump's actions ultimately hurt Republicans in many ways that we may not even know right now?
If the current confusion continues, I think that the cabinet secretaries have to take charge of their agencies and have to say to Trump, look, we thank you for sending Elon Musk over. He's, blown up a lot of things that needed to be blown up. He's taking the heat for us, but it's time for us to sort this out and make sure that it's done in a more measured way that cannot be used against us in the future.
I wrote about this. I mentioned this in The Hill. Well, when Bill Clinton came into office, there was confusion. It was chaos for a while. And he finally brought David Gergen, a Republican strategist, into the White House in May of '93 in order to try to get a handle on things and get things leveled out and a little more stable. I'm wondering, I don't expect Trump to do that, but it sounds like what you're saying is he needs something like that as well.
Well, I hope that Trump learns from the reaction by the stock market and some of the major players in American industry that there's a fine balance between radicalism and shaking up the system that needs shaking up and doing it in a way that inspires confidence rather than confusion.
Well, John, thank you for joining us. My guests are this last two segments. John Fund, he is the national affairs columnist with National Review, longtime writer and observer of the political world, and one of the country's experts on elections and election fraud. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Merrill, and once again, a great job hosting today.
Thank you. When we come back, Dan Pilla and tax questions.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
going through the stations and caught Kirby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kirby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And today is April the 2nd. We are 2 weeks out from the dreaded April 15th. Tax Day. When we are approaching Tax Day, Point of View always goes to Dan Pilla, our tax expert, expert extraordinaire. Dan's been answering questions, Point of View listeners' questions, since the 1980s. So he has been around a long time. He's one of the nation's leaders in taxpayers' rights and defense of IRS abuse prevention and cure. He is the author of 14 books, dozens of research papers. He appears on media time and again, often has a column in National Review talking about special tax issues. And we've got a lot of tax issues coming up. So, Dan, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure, Merle. How are you?
I'm doing well. Good to have you back, my friend.
It's good to be back.
We always know when tax season comes around, we've got to get listeners listening to you, because you are the man with the answers on tax issues. So tell people, we got April 15th coming up. Some people have already sent in their stuff. Others are probably looking at it. What should people be thinking about this tax season that we're in right now? What should they be thinking about, be concerned about, and be aware of?
Well, a couple of things, Merrill. First of all, you've got until April 15th to file the tax return. I think we all know that. What some people don't realize is that if you can't get the return filed by April 15th, you can get an extension of time to file the return. That's IRS Form 4868. File that form on or before April 15th by the due date, and it will get you up to 6 additional months to file the tax return without any failure to file penalties and with no questions asked. You don't even need a reason. So the 4868 gets you the filing extension. But what blindsides people, Merrill, is they don't realize that you still have to pay the tax by April 15th. Even if you get the filing extension, you have to pay the tax by April 15th, which confuses a lot of people, because folks say, well, Dan, it's not the filing that's the problem, it's the tax payment that's the problem.
And I don't have the
money to pay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they might not know what they have to pay. That's for one. That's one thing, but you can cover that by paying 100% of last year's tax, all right? So if you pay 100% of last year's tax by April 15th, we're talking about 2023 now, right? You pay 100% of 2023 tax by April 15th, you'll be covered on the failure to file penalty. But a lot of people have that tax return sitting in front of them right now, Merrill, and they owe 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 grand, and they don't have the money to pay the tax. And now what do? The filing extension is not going to help you with failure to pay the tax because they're still going to charge you with penalties and interest on the failure to pay. But there is a strategy that you can use that nobody knows about. I mean, nobody knows about this, and the IRS never talks about it. It's IRS Form 1127. Form 1127 is called an application for an extension of time to pay the taxes. And if you submit that form by April 15th, you can get up to 6 additional months to pay the taxes without penalties.
Okay, so that is a good step. You know, I mentioned April 15 is a bad day for many people, but it's a good day for other people because many people overpay. They withhold too much money on the taxes, and they get a check back from last year. But is that a good strategy to overpay your taxes and then get that check back?
No, it really isn't. It's a poor strategy because what happens is the IRS is holding your money for over a year, right? You've got a year's worth of withholding all through 2024, 12 months in 2024. Well, here we are 3.5 months into 3 months into 2025, and they still holding your money for 2024, right? Mm-hmm. And so you got what, 12, 15, 16 months of time that the IRS is holding your money, and they're not paying you a nickel's worth of interest on that withholding. Nothing, right? So it's the world's worst way to save money. You really need to adjust your withholding, Merrill, to match your tax liability. And this is a good time to do that. You know, if you're getting a big refund, and the average refund these days is about $3,500, right? So that, I mean, that's a lot of money. That's what, it's $300 a month in and month out, that you're paying to the government that you don't owe them. Right? You don't owe them the money. That's why you got the refund, because you overpaid. And so you're much better off using that money to save or invest somewhere, to pay down other debt, mortgage debt or credit card debt or whatever. You're much better using that money to build a retirement plan. Any strategy is better than letting the IRS hold it for 12, 15 months without paying any interest.
You know, Dan, we just had, we finished up with John Funn, National Review columnist, longtime political expert, and we were talking a bit about Elon Musk and Doge, and one of the things they've been doing is they've been laying off employees at the IRS. So I'm wondering if people sometimes want to call the IRS and ask a question about this, that, or the other. My sense is they're having trouble getting those calls. What's happening there at the IRS? If I need help from the IRS, am I going to be able to get somebody?
Well, in my opinion, it's never been a good idea to call the IRS for help anyway, because, particularly if you're calling for advice on what to do with the tax return and, how to file this, how to claim this or how to claim that. I mean, the answers to taxpayer questions historically have been inaccurate. So I never encourage anybody to call the IRS for help. But if you're calling about some other reason, you got a bill, you're trying to set up an installment payment, any of those kinds of things, then yeah, it can be a problem. But Merrill, again, historically, it's always been the case because, frankly, the IRS spends too doggone much time on enforcement and too little time on taxpayer assistance and education. Now, that said, since the Inflation Adjustment Act was passed in 2020, I believe it was 2022, that the Inflation Adjustment Act was, Inflation Reduction Act was passed, the IRS had the authority to hire up to 85,000 additional IRS employees, and they started that hiring, right? That was not 85,000 overnight. It was 85,000 over 10 years. And so they started that hiring. And so a lot of those employees are the ones that are getting furloughed right now, that are getting RIFed. And so, the IRS has lost, they're telling us about 12 or 14,000 employees here in the last, let's say, last 2 months since the Doge has been doing this. And I just can't believe, Merrill, that it's going to make things any worse than it's been because these were all new employees to begin with, right?
Yeah, and tell us about, I think the IRS has a process now where if I want to just send my information to the IRS, they actually fill out my tax form for me, don't they?
Well, it's not quite that. It's called a direct file system, and the direct file system is a free file program that operates off the IRS's website. It is a very limited program available in a limited number of states that allow people with simple situations, W-2 situations, 1099 situations that are simple, right? 1099 interest, that sort of thing, to free file their tax return. And basically, it's a government system that competes with the TurboTax free file system, and the H&R Block has got their free file system as well. So it's government competition with the private sector on this filing system.
Dan, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to see if you think that's a good idea. My guest for this hour, Dan Pilla. He is the tax expert extraordinaire. Been talking with point of view people since the 80s, asking questions when we call him to find out about what's happening in taxes. A lot of things are happening in taxes right now, and with the legislation that we were just talking about with John Funn. So stay with us. We'll be covering all of those issues when we come back on Point of View.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Doubt is a perennial concern for Christians. Every Christian has feelings of doubt at one time or another. Unfortunately, many Christians assume that doubt is the opposite of faith. They assume that wandering among the hard questions of faith will lead us further from a belief in God. Travis Dickinson, a professor of philosophy at Dallas Baptist University, has his latest book, Wandering Toward God, Finding Faith Amid Doubts and Big Questions. He was in my radio studio recently to talk about his book and provide hope and guidance for Christians who have questions about their faith. Doubt is a natural phenomenon. He quotes from C.S. Lewis, who said, "Now that I'm a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks very improbably. But when I was an atheist, I had moods in which Christianity looked terribly probable." Part of the problem with the way we see doubt is that we assume we must have certainty. But even prominent atheists reject the idea of certainty. Bertrand Russell observed, "The demand for certainty is one which is natural to man, but nevertheless an intellectual vice." Voltaire concluded, "Doubt is not a pleasant condition, but certainty is an absurd one." Travis Dickinson encourages us to ask big questions and look for answers. There are so many theologians and apologists who provide clear and cogent answers to the many questions Christians and non-Christians are asking today. In the concluding chapters, he gives reasons for God and reasons why we can trust the Bible. He also addresses a few of the common questions raised against the gospel and Christianity. Is the God of the Bible good and loving? And why is there so much pain and suffering? So if you know people struggling with doubt about their faith, this is a book that will take them on a journey back to a biblical foundation. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with Dan Pilla talking about all things taxes. And Dan, when we took off for the break, we were talking about the free file system that the IRS has now. Is that if you have a simple tax form and you don't have much, there's not much complicated there, is that a good thing for a person to do?
Well, I got mixed feelings about the government program, Merrill. On the one hand, we've got a tax code that consists of more than 4 million words that was changed more than 6,000 times just since 2001 alone. And I think the IRS has an affirmative obligation to provide as much assistance and education and outreach to citizens as they possibly can to help people comply. People will comply with the law, generally speaking, when they know what they're supposed to do and how to do it, right? People don't want to be criminals. The vast majority of American citizens will screw themselves into the ground to stay current with the IRS because nobody wants to get sideways with the IRS, right? And so on the one hand, I think the IRS certainly has an affirmative duty to provide these tools. On the other hand, they're not that reliable. You'd think the IRS would be able to answer questions on the phone that are accurate, give accurate responses to people's questions about, do I zig or zag with this particular transaction on my tax return? And the IRS historically has been very poor in terms of providing accurate information. And the reason for that is the reason we all struggle with it. There's 4 million words. How are you supposed to keep it all straight? And to make it worse, the IRS is changing the law, or not the IRS, but Congress is changing the law constantly. All right, year after year after year, sometimes multiple times a year, they're changing the law, and it's impossible to keep up with it. And so the IRS is not accurate in the information they provide. So now you say, well, okay, should this agency that's not accurate be providing information to citizens that they need to comply with the law? It's to me, it's a struggle. Whereas the private sector has historically been better able to do these things more cheaply and more efficiently than government.
My understanding is the IRS is working with very old hardware and very old software, slowing things down and just making it more difficult for them to be able to do their job. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it's not fair to say that the IRS's hardware and software across the board is this ancient stuff. There was a statement in one of the IRS's internal documents earlier that I saw, it might have been a year ago or so, where it says that the IRS is operating on Beatles-era technology, right? So 1960s technology. And there's no question, Merrill, that some of the systems that the IRS is using are old systems. Some of their legacy systems are old, but it's certainly not true that across the board their computers are antiquated. Because, I mean, let's just consider this for an example. In the 2024 filing season, a year ago, there were about 162 million individual income tax returns filed and another 110 million business tax returns filed, right? About 85% of those returns were filed electronically. Now, I don't know about you, Merrill, but I'm old enough to know that in the 1960s, you could not file your tax return with the IRS electronically. You couldn't even fill the tax return out on a computer like we do today, right? So, I mean, to say it's all Beatles-era technology, 1960s technology, is not accurate. The other thing that's true is the Congress has appropriated billions, and in fact, tens of billions of dollars to the IRS over the last 40 years to upgrade its computer systems. And every single year, we see a line item in the IRS's budget request for business systems modernization that's in the billions of dollars. It might be 2 or 3 billion, it might be 8 or 10 billion. But this has been going on for 40 years. All right, so to say that they have no up-to-date technology is just not true.
You are an expert on tax issues with small businesses, and I believe you have a book out that's available for small businesses to sort of go through their tax issues. The tariffs that are supposed to be announced today, those can affect small businesses. What are your thoughts about the tariffs and how small businesses are going to be able to respond to those?
Well, a tariff is a tax, Merrill. You know that, and that's the simple fact. And unfortunately, the Trump administration, I'm going to agree with the Trump administration on a great many things, but I'm not going to agree with them on this. You know, they're taking the position that tariffs are paid by foreign producers and foreign governments, and why not have a foreign government pay our, pay the bills for the United States? Why should American producers pay the bills if the foreign country can do it? And that sounds great, but it's just simply not accurate. As you know, a tariff is paid by the consumer in the host in the country where the end product is sold. So when you bring a product into the United States from China or Mexico or pick a place, right, that product is taxed when it enters the country. That's when the tariff is paid. And so the importer pays the tariff. That cost is added on to the cost of the product. So when it ends up on the store shelf and the consumer buys it, the end price includes the cost of that tariff. So American consumers are paying that tax. There's no question about it. And so you say, well, okay, well, why have an American consumer pay the tax if it's not the foreign government? Why have the American consumer do it? Well, Trump is arguing that he can use tariffs to replace the income tax. Well, I don't think that's all that feasible, but Merrill, because right now the federal government is collecting roughly $5 trillion in revenue. About 65% of that money, 70% of that money is coming from the personal and corporate income tax. Another 20% of it's coming from the payroll taxes, Social Security, Medicare. Only 2% of the revenue is coming from tariffs. So, you got $5 trillion in incoming revenue. They're spending $6.5 trillion. So we got that deficit to make up. How are you going to do that with a system that's collecting 2% of the revenue? It doesn't seem feasible to me. It just doesn't. The better idea, Merrill, is to cut federal spending dramatically and to cut the personal income tax dramatically. I would argue to eliminate the corporate income tax entirely. It's an economic falsehood anyway, and so I would eliminate that and drastically reduce the personal income tax and the payroll tax to reflect a cut in spending and do it that way.
I guess my question is, if you're a small business and you've been importing various things, and sometimes you have the other countries are the only ones that make something that's not made here in the United States, are they going to have to? Does this put an extra burden, just a time and process burden, on small business if they're having to deal with these tariffs?
Well, there's no question about that. Now, I don't know how it would affect the timing of a small business.
No, I just mean taking time to do to sort of work through that.
Oh, yeah. In terms of compliance time, there's no doubt about that. The increased tariffs to the extent that you're taxing products that might not have been taxed before, and now businesses are facing a new tax that they're not accustomed to dealing with. There's no question that will involve compliance costs that were not prior, that were not there previously, no doubt about that. And so, that increases the cost of doing business, which, by the way, is passed on to the consumer as well. So the bottom line is the prices in the marketplace end up more expensive with tariffs than they otherwise would.
The Trump administration and the Congress are looking at a number of tax changes. I want to go through some of those things and what you think are the best tax changes and those that are not that good. So we've got a couple of minutes before the break, so get us started here on what you think are good in the proposed changes.
Well, let's just talk very generally, and then you can get specific after the break. Very, very generally, Merrill, I think the Congress has to renew the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Mm-hmm.
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was Trump's first tax law that was effective in
2017.
January of 20. It was passed in 2017.
Yeah.
Yeah, passed in 2017, was effective in 2018, and that's what we've been operating under ever since. Now, that law, all 67 or 68 provisions of that law expire at the end of this year. And if that's the case, then you're going to see an across-the-board tax increase on just about every American, right? The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act substantially cut taxes, particularly for middle-income and lower-income citizens in a lot of different ways. And if that expires, then you're going to see a remarkable tax increase across the board. So it has to be extended. There's no question about that. Now, as I stand here, I believe that Congress is going to do that. They're going to adopt, or I should say, renew the vast majority of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act with some changes, which we can talk about.
Okay. My guest for this hour, Dan Pilla. He is a tax expert. 1-800-351-1212. If you have a question for Dan about your taxes, about the tax system, if you're an individual, small business, and you have questions, give us a call. 1-800-351-1212. Dan can answer those questions. When we come back, we want to talk a little bit more about some of these new taxes that tax breaks they're looking at, tax changes in the law, and how that's going to affect us and business. Stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome back to Point of View. My guest by phone, tax expert Dan Pilla, and we're talking about all things taxes. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to give us a call and ask Dan a question. We've got Benjamin from Georgia, who is a part-time pastor, and he's got a question. Benjamin, you're on the phone. Go ahead.
Hello, how you doing, Merrill and Mr. Pilla? I love the show. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I have a question. I am at my church. We're a medium-sized church, about 400 to 500 people. I'm an associate pastor, which I'm the family pastor. So I'm not full-time. I am retired military, so I have income, and I work a job that I work full-time. But I get a housing allowance from my church, which is about $500 a month, and I've asked, I'm like, well, this just started. I've been a pastor about 7 years now, and this has just started in the last 2 years. But it makes it difficult when I claim this on my taxes because I asked for 1099, in which my church is pretty good with the numbers, but we haven't got any guidance. And I've asked, and it's hard because they're confused. And I'm like, what do I do with this extra $6,000 a year that I bring in? Also, another issue is
let me stop you right. Let me stop you right there, Benjamin, and let's talk about the housing allowance. The housing allowance is not taxable income. All right, you pay tax on whatever salary you earn from the church, but apparently you aren't getting a salary. You're getting a salary from your military or not a salary, but you're getting your military pension plus wages from another job. Now, the wages from the other job certainly would be taxable. Not sure about your military pension. It would be depending on whether it's a medical pension, an injury pension or not, but the housing allowance is not taxable. They should not be issuing a 1099 to you on the housing allowance. That specifically is not taxable income.
And they haven't. I greatly appreciate that. And so that goes on top of my other question. Besides my tithe and offering, which me and my wife, we tithe and offer about. She's a nurse. I'm a bookkeeper by trade. And what we have is we pay above and beyond our tithe and offering, so about 15, almost 20% a year into the church. But on top of that, I spend about $10,000 a year traveling, going to a general conference from Georgia to California, plane tickets. I just went to a ministry conference in Louisiana during Snowmageddon. And but at the end of the year, when it's time to I barely make enough to take the itemized currently ever since 2017. I barely make enough to be able to itemize as opposed to standard, but I'm spending like an additional $10,000 a year and just ministry expenses out of pocket, not asking the church for it, but just paying for like my own hotel when I go to places, things such as that.
Well, those are itemized deductions, right? You say you're making enough to get over the itemized deduction. Okay, well, you need to be adding those things in. The charitable mileage is deductible at I don't know what the rate is off the top of my head. It's about 12 or 14 cents a mile for charitable miles, and then all of the expenses you incur out of pocket to carry out religious charitable activity are considered charitable contributions as well that would get deducted. So you need to count all that stuff, Benjamin, and add it to your Schedule C as a deduction.
Schedule C is my okay. And
I'm sorry, I said Schedule C.
Right.
Wait a minute, Benjamin, stop. I said Schedule C. It's Schedule A. It's an itemized deduction on Schedule A for charitable contributions, not C, A.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I think that helps a lot. The answers, I'm not as nervous. I got the claim. Last year I was short. I had to do an extension because I had owed. And so therefore I just wanted to make sure I was correct before I complete all these and do this year's also. But I greatly appreciate it, sir. Thank you for your service. I appreciate it.
Right. Thank you, Benjamin. And now we're going to go to Rebecca in California. She's a small business and has a question for you, Dan.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan, for taking my call. I agree with you that the IRS is not always accurate when they give directions or when they do, tell you how to do this, how to do that, or anything that defines what the difference between the different kinds of tax forms. And I'm in that dilemma. I'm a professor of literature, English, so I know what to look for when it comes to defining. Long story short, I have written letters after letters after letters explaining that that I am not, my organization's 501c3 is a charitable organization, not a private foundation. And I'm sitting here right now with a letter that I received from them saying, oh, Dr. Lindsay, your organization is a private foundation. You'll need to now pay $600 if you want to change it back over to a charitable organization on the paperwork. Well, the problem is they did not define it accurately. Tell me what the difference is between a charitable organization and a private foundation. They did not do that. So I'm in a dilemma, and I don't know whether to go ahead this year and fill out the 990-PF or just dissolve the organization.
Well, I would not fill out a tax return that you know is incorrect. If you are not a private foundation, but you are a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, charitable, religious, educational, that sort of thing, then file the regular 990 form. And if the IRS challenges the form, then appeal the decision that they've made with respect to the challenge. Now, the other thing you might do is contact the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. If you've got an ongoing problem with their misdefining who you are, the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate can get you in touch with the people in the IRS that can sort this out. I can tell you that just calling them on the phone is not going to do you any good. You got to do this in writing. You got to get in touch with the Taxpayer Advocate. And as I said, don't file a return that you know is inaccurate based on the facts of your case.
Okay, I'm on it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm glad I heard you giving me this suggestion. I will follow through with that. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, Dan, let's talk about some of the tax proposals, the new tax breaks. They're looking at no taxes paid on tips, no taxes on your Social Security retirement check, and no taxes on overtime. I think those are the only three. There may be something else, but what do you think about those tax breaks?
Well, there are some other things, Merrill, but to start with those things first, I like the idea of no tax on Social Security. That to me is a no-brainer. I think the no tax on tips and the no tax on overtime, you and I have talked about this before, and I think that those two proposals raise substantial administrative questions. In other words, how is it going to be enforced? If we're not going to tax tips, does that mean that there's no longer going to be an American citizen working for wages, that every American citizen out there is going to be working for tips? What am I going to do with my employees? Am I going to stop calling them, calling their compensation wages and salary and just give them tips? Hey, you did a good job this week, so here's your tip. And now it's not taxable. What kind of definitions are we going to have, and what kind of audits are going to arise as a result of employers doing what I just said? Not paying wages anymore, but paying tips. And the other thing is, how is that going to affect minimum wage laws, Merrill? What are America's unions going to do when all these companies stop paying minimum wage on the idea that they're all getting tips? I think that raises a lot of questions. And I think we have the same problem. We have precisely the same problem with overtime. We're now we're considered 35 or 40 hours a week is considered full time. Well, now every employer in the country is going to go to 5 hours a week full time, and everything after that is overtime, right? And so now all that's not taxable. It just creates, in my mind, too many enforcement and administrative problems that are going to lead to difficult challenges for American businesses. The better idea is reduce the tax liabilities overall for people, and that is just much simpler.
I have to agree with you on Social Security as well. I mean, Social Security is a tax we've paid in, and then you bring it, if you make some income, you're liable to pay a tax on Social Security depending upon your income. And that seems like we're taxing a tax that I paid in years ago.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Social Security is a tax. It's exactly what it is. It's a flat tax on wage income. It applies to the $401st of wage income up to the cap, or earned income, I should say, up to the cap, whatever it is. About about $130,000 or $40,000 these days. So you're paying an additional income tax on that money that Washington pretends goes into a savings account with your name on it. But of course, you and I know it doesn't. It just goes into general revenue, and it's spent by the government out through general revenue. Basically, current Social Security recipients get the money that current wage earners are paying into Social Security, so it's kind of a Ponzi scheme in that sense. And it shouldn't be taxed twice, no doubt about it.
1-800-351-1212 if you want to contact us for our final segment with Dan Pilla. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back in our final segment with tax expert Dan Pilla. He has been able to help Benjamin and Rebecca, and now we're going to go to Tom in California, who has a very interesting question. Tom, you are on the air.
Okay, great. Thank you for taking my call. I'm on a financial committee at my church, and we recently got $170-something thousand from the federal government, which is part of this Employee Retention Credits, or ERC.
Sure.
We applied for it about two years ago, and we just got it. And I'm wondering, is this all legitimate money, assuming we filled out our forms right? It seems like it's too good to be true.
Well, it does seem like it's too good to be true, Tom. And as a matter of fact, there's been a real problem with bogus ERC claims that were being made over the last couple of years, to the point where in September of 2023, the IRS actually shut down the processing of ERC claims until they could sort out the process of screening these things before they grant them. So I have to assume that I won't assume anything. Assuming that your forms were filled out correctly and that the supporting documents were provided with the forms when you sent them in, that would have been an amended 1040X, an amended 941X is what you filed to get that claim, then that is legitimate money, no doubt about it. Now, the federal government, this is one of the giveaway COVID programs that started in March of 2020, and Merrill, you know that there was about, 7 or 8, maybe $9 trillion with these giveaway programs that they started, the Paycheck Protection Loans, the Employee Retention Credits, all of these, the EIDL loans through the Department of Labor, through the Small Business Administration. There's trillions of dollars that was given away. And that's what it is. It's just giveaway money. But again, Tom, assuming your forms are correct and your supporting documents are in order, it's your money, man.
No tax on that form?
No, it's no tax. It's actually a refund of taxes that were paid in. Plus some.
Okay. All right, great. Well, thank you very much for the call.
All right. Well, you're welcome.
And thank you, Tom. Well, you've been able to help some people there today, Dan. So we talked a little bit about some of the tax breaks they're considering. Tell us some of the other things you mentioned.
Yeah, one of the things that's on the table here now is a change to the state and local tax deduction.
Oh, yeah, the SALT tax.
The so-called SALT. And that is, Merrill, that's your state income taxes, your real estate taxes, state sales taxes, and so on, that you have historically been allowed to write off on your 1040 form as a itemized deduction. Well, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that was limited to just $10,000. So people in high tax states like Minnesota, where I live, and California, New York, and so on, these people have been hit hard because some of these people pay double or triple that much in state and local taxes, and they were able to write them off, and now they're not. So one of the things that has happened in the last 6 weeks here is Republican representatives from these high tax states have been pressuring the Trump administration to either substantially increase the cap or eliminate it altogether. All right, so there have been a number of proposals out there. One is on the table now to go to $25,000 on the cap from 10 to 25. Of course, a lot of representatives are pushing for complete elimination. Another alternative has been a $100,000 cap. So what comes out the other end in the wash, just remains to be seen. But I will tell you this, Merrill, there's going to be a change to the SALT cap, right? It's not going to be 10 grand anymore. Probably isn't going to be 25 grand. Might be as high as 100 grand.
Oh, you think it'd be that high?
I think it could be, yeah.
So the problem that the Republicans have right now is paying for this because we have the issue of the CBO, and for our listeners, the way the CBO works is it scores tax bills. It scored the 2017 bill, but that ends next year, I guess the end of this year. And so the way the CBO scores this is it goes back to the current law, which means there wouldn't be a tax bill. And that means if you pass the tax bill, essentially the 2017 with a few adjustments to it, they're going to start with something like a $2 trillion deficit because they're saying, well, it was going to go back. We're going to have all these new taxes, which nobody really believed we were going to go that way anyway. So what do we do about this? How do you do this and try to get these deficits down?
Well, Merrill, you know this better than I do. There's only one way to do it, and that's cut spending. And the question is who in Washington has the courage to cut the spending to the level it needs to be cut to get this under control. If everything stays the same the way it is right now, we're still talking about a $1.3 or $1.4 trillion deficit. Never mind all of these additional tax cuts that are on the table. All right, how are they going to deal with that? We have gotten to the point, Merrill, where no one seems to care anymore about what the level of debt and deficit year-to-year deficit and total debt is anymore. We're at what, $38 trillion of total debt. that's gone up, astronomically here in the last 10 years. And now we're not talking about, in the early 1990s, we were talking about, $200 and $300 billion deficits, and that was causing people to pull their hair out. Well, now we're at 1.2, $1.5 trillion in deficits, and people just shrug their shoulders. It's just unbelievable how far we've come with the level of irresponsibility in Washington toward the spending. It's about the spending. It's never about revenue. It's always about the spending.
And the only way you think we're going to be able to do that is cut the spending? Are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful. I like some of the things that DOJ is coming up with, but even that, Merrill, the administrative portion of the federal government is only about 3 or 4% of the budget. As you know, the largest single items, plural items, in federal spending are Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Those three things are responsible for about 70% of total federal spending. Right now, you add in the military, you add in the interest on the debt, which is that approaching $1 trillion yet, Merrill? The interest on the debt?
I think
are we
so.
At that point yet?
Yeah, I think so.
I think we're getting close to that. You add those things in, man. That's what's eating up the budget. And yeah, okay, we need to cut fraud in the Medicare system. We need to cut fraud in the Social Security system. No doubt about that. We need to cut waste, fraud, and duplication in all these various agencies. All right, there shouldn't be an extra dollar spent that shouldn't be spent. I agree with that. The vast majority of the American people agree with that. But you aren't going to fix the problem by dealing with this now. Not that we shouldn't address this. We need to. But that doesn't solve the problem. It's the transfer payments, the giveaway programs that are causing the problems.
Dan, take about 30 seconds to tell people how they can get in touch with you and what they can find.
Yeah, the best way to get in touch with me is go to my website, which is taxhelponline.com. That's all one word, taxhelponline.com. You buy any book off my website at any price point. My latest book is called Dan Pilla's Small Business Tax Guide. Get any book off the website, and you get a free 15-minute consultation directly with me. So if you're a small business, you need help with your tax compliance, you want to avoid the 16 or 17 most common problems that small businesses have with the IRS, get the book, Dan Pilla's Small Business Tax Guide. You'll get a free 15-minute consultation with me. Go straight to my website, taxhelponline.com, to order.
And you help individuals as well, don't you?
Oh, yeah. Individuals and small businesses. That's where I focus. Yes, sir.
And what's the biggest problem people have out there when they're facing the IRS?
Well, the single biggest problem is ignorance, not knowing what their options are, not knowing what's coming down the pike, not understanding how to respond to the IRS and how to deal with them and how to negotiate with them. That's the problem, is ignorance, Merrill. People are afraid, and fear immobilizes people, and it gets them into a position where they end up getting run over.
Dan Pilla, thank you for joining us. Always excellent to have you on the program to talk about the tax issues and provide a little clarity in a very murky situation. Thank you.
All right. It's always my pleasure, Merrill. Thanks for having me.
And if you want to find out more about Dan Pilla, you can go to pointofview.net. We have that information there for you, so you can reach out to him if you want to and see what you can find through his services. He's been around here on Point of View for decades now. So I want to thank you for joining, Megan for doing the engineering, Steve for doing the production, and we will be back on Point of View tomorrow.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
you.